So our last speaker, commentator today is Jonathon Catlin. He is a postdoctoral associate in the Humanities Center at the University of Rochester until April or May this year. Next year. Oh, I was 25 here. He earned his doctorate at Princeton University in 2023. There he wrote a dissertation on the concept of catastrophe in 20th century German and Jewish thought from the interwar period to the present day. And he is an expert on members of the Frankfurt School, I think Adorno in particular. And he also tries to understand the current climate crisis in historical terms. Something I'd love to hear more about. Jonathon, please. Thank you so much.
All right, first, thanks so much to Sky and the organizers for including me in this amazing event. In this session on the continuities of fascism, one of the central questions we've been tasked with addressing is whether contemporary political movements can rightly be characterized as fascist. Given her central role in some of these debates, Jennifer Evans is uniquely well positioned to address this question. Here, her paper shows how gender, sexuality, and desire have served both as sources of anti-fascist mobilization and as a site of anxiety and fear mobilizing the political right. In this response, I first address what I see as some of the conclusions of the so-called fascism debate of recent years. I then think with Jennifer's paper on the way gender and sexuality have come to animate so much of contemporary right-wing politics, somewhat complicating the picture Jennifer paints by illustrating a rift between mainly white gays and lesbians who have achieved not only acceptance but also significant positions of power within the contemporary political right. To put my cards on the table, I'm a historian of concepts who, like Andy, Enzo, and Reinhard Koselleck before them, take seriously the way fascism has accrued sedimented meanings in its century of service as a political Kampfbegriff. Following Bruce Kucklick's book, Fascism Comes to America, I recognize that for a century, every political position has been besmirched as fascist. Yet this does not mean that fascism is devoid of meaning or that it has become a vacuous signifier. Against historians, the historian's impulse to chastise such anachronistic or merely political uses of the concept, I'll end with a suggestion that we may well need this contested concept still today. So the meaning of the category of fascism has, of course, animated many scholars of especially German history and fascism since Trump announced his run for president in June 2015. In the last year, the first chapter of the so-called fascism debate came to a close after being canonized in an edited volume entitled Did It Happen Here? Perspectives on Fascism and America, edited by Daniel Steinmetz-Jenkins, and featuring contributions from many scholars well known to all of you. During Trump's first term, the camp skeptical of the thesis that Trump is a fascist, among them Daniel Bessner, Udi Greenberg, Samuel Moyn, and Corey Robin, saw appeals to the rhetoric of authoritarianism and fascism coming most loudly from Cold War liberals like Madeleine Albright, Timothy Snyder, and Anne Applebaum as a distraction from building a left populist answer to Trump through something like the Bernie Sanders movement. Liberal obsessions with Russiagate and impeachment so preoccupied liberals that they spoke derisively of Trump's supporters as deplorables, but declined to recognize the real harms that decades of neoliberal policies had done to them or to offer any compelling alternative. To reprise the old line from Max Horkheimer, it seemed to many on the left that those who wished to speak of Trump's fascism could not at the same time remain silent about the conditions of neoliberal capitalism that had enabled his rise. In Trump's first term, Corey Robin continually pointed out Trump's weakness in office, the chaos of a revolving door of staff turnover, the failure of his policy agenda to get through Congress, aside from tax cuts, which was neoconservative business as usual. While war criminal George Bush was apparently recuperated by resistance liberals, Robin noted the way that conservative presidents in American history, from Nixon to Reagan, always tended to appear more benign in the rose-tinted glasses of liberal posterity when faced with new threats. The Weimar analogy never felt quite right. Rather, as Mosse argued, it made more sense to say that figures like Trump and Le Pen performed fascism in a very different context, Enzo's concept of post-fascism rightly emphasizes its chronological distinctiveness and locates it in a historical sequence, implying both continuity and transformation. After January 6th, Robert Paxton changed his diagnosis and conceded that the insurrection on the Capitol, however failed or parodic, marked a qualitative shift in the MAGA movement, which had finally achieved what leftists like Dylan Riley had long considered one of the missing pieces in the Weimar analogy, insurrectionary street violence. Yet even after January 6th, Richard Evans still did not consider Trump a fascist, centrally because his America First foreign policy didn't pursue wars of imperialist expansion, but rather argued for disengaging from them, for example, in Syria. Evans wrote that January 6th was more like the failed Munich beer hall putsch of November 1923 than Berlin 10 years later. He said it was a lack of democratic faith rather than a violent seizure of power that was the true threat to American democracy. Contra Timothy Snyder's hyperbolic warnings to watch out for an impending Reichstag fire, Evans wrote that expecting a return of the past would not be helpful in navigating this crisis, for, quote, "You can't win the political battles of the present if you're always stuck in the past." Christopher Browning likewise wrote that if the US has someone whom historians will look back on as the gravedigger of American democracy, it is not Trump, but Mitch McConnell. The analogy to be made was not between Trump and Hitler, but between the conservative elites enabling Trump and Paul von Hindenburg. A few weeks after the 2024 election, as many liberals resigned themselves to a second Trump term, Corey Robin again observed, "The mood seems to be that the Dems lost, now they have to regroup and regain power. The alarmism of 2016 is just not there. There's simply a recognition that, having been elected through ordinary democratic means, Trump must be fought and defeated through ordinary democratic means. As Robin glibly concludes, quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of the Democrats or electoral democracy." Robin's problem isn't with the fascist label itself, but the hypocritical disconnect between the resistance liberals' extraordinary political rhetoric and their utterly ordinary political behavior and expectations. The resistance liberals Robin criticizes have made much of associations between Trump and the January 6th riot, the Proud Boys, the alt-right, and the like. As reprehensible as such groups may be, focus on them has often misled coverage of Trump's actual governance. In his 1959 essay, The Meaning of the Working Through the Past, Theodor Adorno claimed that he considered the survival of National Socialism within democracy to be potentially more dangerous than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy. That lecture was indeed occasioned by a resurgence of anti-Semitic violence and neo-Nazi activity in the Federal Republic. But what concerned Adorno was less the small lunatic fringe of neo-Nazis than the Holocaust denial and regressive policies within the governing Grand Coalition of the liberal center, many of whom were, of course, former Nazis. Jennifer suggests a similar oblique approach to fascism, the fascism question, through Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the micro-fascism of everyday desire. This approach is also taken up in Richard Seymour's recent book, Disaster Nationalism, another kind of framework, which considers the plainly ethno-nationalist far-right regimes in India and Israel as distinct from the less coherent MAGA movement. Disaster nationalism, Seymour argues, offers what he calls a balm of vengeance that makes false ideas like conspiracies and the belief in hallucinatory catastrophes not simply possible as a result of fake news, but actually attractive. There's an element of desire. As Guattari wrote decades ago, quote, "Fascism seems to come from the outside, but it finds its energy right in the heart of everybody's desire." And as Foucault similarly warned, fascism is in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates us and exploits us. On the fascism debate, Seymour concludes that what we've seen in the US and Western Europe is, quote, "not yet fascism," even if, as Jennifer's paper explores, the desire for fascism may be evident all around us. Okay, next section. On a recent episode of Jacobin's podcast, The Dig, host Daniel Denver said, quote, "If you told me 20 years ago that a far-right political movement would take over the Republican Party and that gay men would be in many positions of significant power, I would not have believed you." Denver names three names. First, gay billionaire Scott Bessent, Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary. Second, Richard Grinnell, his former ambassador to Germany and now special missions envoy. And third, Peter Thiel, the billionaire co-founder of PayPal and mentor of J.D. Vance. And of course, there's also the well-known right-wing Breitbart personality, Milo Yiannopoulos. In a viral video clip of Trump at a Mar-a-Lago event in April 2022, we hear Trump giving shout-outs to different groups in the room, in the crowd, until he asks, "Where's gays for Trump?" When they answer his call with cheers, he surveys them and declares, "You don't look gay." Right-wing gays are not only an American phenomenon. In a recent poll for Germany's February 23rd federal election, the leading candidate for chancellor in a recent poll was not the expected CDU leader, Friedrich Merz, but the AfD's Alice Weidel, a lesbian with 24% of the vote. She's a very charismatic leader. Just days before, Elon Musk had posted on X that, quote, "Only the AfD can save Germany." For years, Vidal has used her identity to advance the homo-nationalist argument that only the AfD can keep the LGBT community safe from what she calls Muslim gangs through their harsh anti-immigrant policies. Vidal offers a queer form of what Sarah Ferris has called femo-nationalism, which is exemplified by figures like Giorgia Meloni. As Udi Greenberg has observed, this represents a new cocktail of far-right politics, celebrating women's participation in public affairs while reinforcing an anti-feminist message. And this is not an exception, he says, but is now typical of the far right in Europe. As Greenberg argues, despite its strong politics of the family, the contemporary radical right has developed a profoundly non-fascist vision of gender norms, which he says explains its growing appeal to women. Parties from the AfD to Hungary's Fidesz support pro-family and childcare provisions in the service of ethno-nationalist pronatalism. As Jennifer explores, there's a long and troubled anti-fascist tradition of associating fascism with male homosexuality, which Carolyn Dean explains as, quote, "a powerful link between a pathological politics and a pathological homosexuality." We all know the infamous cases of Ernst Röhm and others. In 1934, there was such a strong association on the left between homosexuality and fascism that Klaus Mann once remarked that due to these suspicions, gay men had become, quote, "the Jews of the left." As Jennifer notes, in his exilic reflections in Minima Moralia, dated to 1944, Adorno infamously wrote, quote, "Totalitarianism and homosexuality belong together." As he explained, in its downfall, the subject negates everything which is not of its own kind. The opposites of the strong man and the compliant youth merge in an order which asserts unalloyed the male principle of domination. But by the 1960s, Adorno would become a champion with his friend, the gay Jewish jurist Fritz Bauer, of abolishing paragraph 175 and legalizing gay sex in West Germany. His 1950 co-authored study, The Authoritarian Personality, mainly considered authoritarian biases against gay men and treated fear of homosexual attack and homosexual panic, as they called them, as signs of repressed homosexual impulses in the authoritarian. Yet the book nevertheless advanced the psychoanalytic notions that latent homosexuality was an essential characteristic of conformity itself. So the idea was that unconscious fantasies of homosexual submission to the father enabled submission to the Führer. In their provocative podcast and book, Bad Gays, Ben Miller and Hugh Lemmy investigate evil gay men in history, from Alexander the Great to Ernst Röhm to J. Edgar Hoover and Roy Cohn. And they were forced to stop making episodes about living people after Andrew Sullivan, a gay conservative and longtime editor of The New Republic, threatened to sue them following an episode on him. Sullivan is a model bad gay, a rich, conservative, cis white gay man who infamously proclaimed the end of an epidemic in 1996 when life-saving drugs for HIV/AIDS became available for people like him. The millions still dying from the virus be damned. In a recent essay, Sullivan calls for abandoning the acronym LGBTQ+, because it puts bourgeois white gays like himself in a more precarious company, writing that, quote, "the most controversial question in the LGBTQ+ space, the transing of children with gender dysphoria, directly pits the interest of gay and lesbian kids against those of trans kids." For as he goes on, gay people have had to struggle to their own sex and their own bodies, while trans people have had to struggle to disown theirs. On this core question, he says, our interests are in fact diametrically opposed. And Jennifer's paper is acutely attuned to these, what she calls inequalities within mainstream LGBTQ organizations. Yet while many of these cases of these conflicts have indeed been, as she writes, productively contentious and multidimensional, there are also many cases like Sullivan and trans-exclusionary feminists where bridges of solidarity have been deliberately burned. Miller and Lemmy offer an entertaining, quote, dance through homosexuality's usable and abusable pasts. But more seriously, they conduct a postmortem on what they call the failure of homosexuality as an identity and as a political project. Among their chief concerns are the failures of solidarity among privileged white gay men with non-gender conforming queers and racial and colonial others, with whom we now recognize their solidarities always remain incomplete. As they quote Susan Stryker, homosexuality's projection of self-justification has often depended on claiming normalcy at the expense of a gender non-conforming other, the trans woman, the street queen, the person not respectable enough to pass. Figures like Sullivan, who championed respectability politics through gay marriage, homonormativity, and homonationalism, have actively contributed to the current gender panic by spreading anti-trans misinformation. Miller and Lemmy also invoked the late Marxist Christopher Chitty, who argued that for centuries, emancipation for elite gays has often come at the cost of criminalizing their poor working class and sex worker fellows, while at the same time often later appropriating their work of proverbially throwing the first bricks at Stonewall. As Leo Bersani has written, the troubling reality of homonormativity is that you can be victimized and in no way be radical. The now canonized name of Trump's movement, MAGA, at first seems to fit Roger Griffin's conception of fascism as palingenesis, a mythic promise of national or ethnic rebirth. Yet in his postmortem on the 2024 election, Gabriel Winant observed that the liberal view of the movement as regressive is far too simple. Rather, he writes, although on the surface MAGA is nostalgic, Trump's movement has been immensely historically generative, creating new modes of political expression, opening new arenas of policymaking, mass deportation, anti-trans assaults, vaccine skepticism, the list goes on. The central case relevant here, as Molly mentioned, is this television ad in the Trump campaign, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. The campaign spent at least $215 million on this ad alone, more than on ads on every other issue combined. The ad itself did not test well with audiences, but the campaign doubled down on it anyway. It aired more than 30,000 times across every swing state. And pundits seem to agree that it paid off. One Republican strategist called the ads wildly successful at boosting Republican turnout. The 2024 election saw the first transgender candidate elected to Congress, Sarah McBride of Delaware, but it was also one in which the nebulous other, they, them became a threatening specter animating Trump's expanding multiracial base. This is the context in which ACLU staffer Jillian Brandstetter described misogyny and against trans women as one of the most powerful political forces in the world, and in which historian Jill Peterson has decried a new war on trans life as an attempt to build what they call a cisgender state. One of the central questions of Jennifer's paper is whether these contemporary sex and gender panics amount to the microfascism analyzed by Deleuze and Guattari, or to fascism proper. Judith Butler has not minced words in their own judgment. They said in a recent interview just a few weeks ago, quote, once you decide that a single vulnerable minority can be sacrificed, you're operating within a fascist logic, because that means that there might be a second one, or you're willing to sacrifice a third and a fourth, and then what happens? Butler describes Trump's re-election as a restoration fantasy at play in many right-wing movements in the US. People want to go back to the idea of being a white country, or the idea of the patriarchal family, the principle that marriages are for heterosexuals. They call it a nostalgic fury for an impossible past. In Jason Stanley's popular conception, fascism comes down to a politics of us against them. In the contemporary political conjuncture in both the US and Europe, the them is centrally the migrant, the Muslim, But the trans athlete, the bathroom, or the groomer is also there. And these phantom enemies come together in Trump's outlandish invocation of the illegal transgender alien in prison, ripping off the real American cis-hetero taxpayer. One of the central insights of Jennifer's paper is that this is not just a fascism of the political fringe, but a populist pandering and willingness to scapegoat also of the liberal center. One of the most remarkable signs I've seen at protests in the past year reads, "With liberals like these, who needs fascists?" In Germany, it's not only the far-right AfD, but especially the liberal parties chasing them to the right who have eagerly undermined countless basic protections of democratic life for political and academic expression and safety in the name of defending Jews more vigorously than their strange bedfellows of the AfD, all while vilifying Jews like Judith Butler, not incidentally a non-binary gender theorist and anti-Zionist, as an anti-Semite and Hamas apologist. Even Susan Neiman, no friend of wokeness, postmodernism, or post-colonial theory, says of the newly adopted anti-Semitism resolution, quote, "I think it's a disaster and I think it will increase anti-Semitism." To conclude, for all due attention to MAGA's nostalgic myths of national restoration and to analogies to Weimar and history's strongmen, what we're witnessing is less a replay of the fascist past than a new politics of the post-fascist present. To my mind, the takeaway remains one Dagmar taught us all in Sex After Fascism years ago, that following Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis, fascist movements are not simply repressive of deviant sexuality and women's liberation, but at the same time also highly productive of new incitements and forms of desire. By tracing their longer genealogies, Jennifer's paper helps us see these much more clearly. Thank you.